Northwest Mounted Police protected the railroad much more than they protected the Indians. While the Plains Indian faded into administrative obscurity, the mounted police became the iconic figure representation of justice in Canada. They were the clean, moral, upstanding representation of Canada the Good. In the 20th century, Aboriginal people emerged as the permanent underclass in an immigrant country. Their position was solidified by the failure of federal policies that attempted to assimilate the Indian. The relationship between police and Aboriginal people took on the character of enforcer and perpetrator. Not only were Aboriginal people seen as a political problem, but they were also seen as a social problem. By the second half of the 20th century, Aboriginal peoples were gaining greater strength politically and making demands upon their rights. They had also blossomed into a full-fledged social dilemma for law enforcement. The potential solution was to incorporate Aboriginal people into police forces, as well as developing the capacity of reserve communities to have a limited enforcement jurisdiction. Currently, the federal government promotes a tripartite agreement between provinces, the federal government, and Indian Act bands to provide policing on reserve. The RCMP has also made significant progress toward developing a First Nations policing program. The RCMP provides policing for every province and territory except for Ontario and Quebec. Their policing, generally for reserve and off-reserve Aboriginal people, includes providing service levels that are equivalent to non-First Nations communities. They also try to achieve a compatibility and sensitivity to First Nations culture and beliefs. And they also attempt to be flexible in providing services, the kind of services that Aboriginal communities need. While these principles are welcome intentions, the reality is not always what the principles would like to reflect. In the 1960s, the RCMP withdrew policing services from First Nations in Ontario and Quebec. It was a transitional phase that was completed in 1971. The legacy of the RCMP was lasting, and the attitudes and procedures remain much the same as the Ontario Provincial Police and Quebec Sûreté de Québec began to take up their responsibilities. By 1971, political pressure from Aboriginal political groups had grown to the point where demands for independent Aboriginal community policing and the Department of Indian and Northern Development issued Circular 55, which introduced the idea of developing Aboriginal policing organizations that would work under the auspices of either the RCMP or provincial police services. Let's look at Ontario in particular because it remains a fairly good example of the kind of policing that's done in Aboriginal communities across the country. You can see from this slide that some progress is being made. 22 First Nations communities continue to be served by the Ontario Provincial Police or Municipal Police Services. 19 of the First Nations communities are served by First Nations police officers who are administered by the OPP, and a whole lot, 95 First Nations communities are served by 9 self-administered First Nations police services like the Anishinaabe-Aski Police, the Six Nations Police, and so on. The other alternative was to create Aboriginal police officers within the existing forces, and so the Ontario Indian Special Constables program was created. These police officers work on reserve, but are directly responsible to the Ontario Provincial Police. In some cases, this program has led to the creation of full-fledged constables working for the band and continuing to be supervised by the Ontario Provincial Police. Through the last decade of the 20th century, progress continued to be made. This was built on the success of the integration of Aboriginal police officers, both male and female, into the existing forces, as well as establishing community-based policing. Standalone police forces began in 1994 with the Anishinaabe-Aski Police Services in Ontario. The Anishinaabe-Aski Police Services now contracts out and serves a number of communities across Ontario. While Aboriginal community policing is a complicated process, ranging from family disputes to criminal activity, in the 1990s, political activism initiated a new set of dilemmas for law enforcement. Political movements escalated into active resistance, violent confrontations at Oka, Quebec, Kanesatake, and Gustafson Lake in British Columbia, as well as Burnt Church and Ipperwash Provincial Park in Ontario. Simmering neglect by both provincial and federal authorities contributed to a sense of desperation on the part of Aboriginal people. Enforcement agencies were expected to take the part of the governments in these confrontations. It became evident with the death of Dudley George that governments were manipulating police and enforcement agencies to their own ends. After prolonged public demand, the Ontario government finally consented to an inquiry into the death of Dudley George and the standoff at the Ipperwash Provincial Park. The findings initiated new policy on the part of the Ontario Provincial Police and were regarded as precedent-setting for police services across the country. They declared that from now on, Ontario Provincial Police would act in the best interest of the public, that they were keepers of the peace, and that their real job was to protect the public, not the political interests of any particular group. In 2004, the Ontario Provincial Police established the Aboriginal Relations Team, which was made up of Aboriginal officers of the OPP who were designated to work in confrontation situations. By 2009, the ART team was virtually disbanded due to political interference. It is clear that political activism and confrontation will continue between Aboriginal people and provincial and federal governments. Some Aboriginal activists and organizations have been called homegrown terrorists. It is likely that violent confrontations and tragedies such as happened at Ipperwash will continue. A brighter perspective is the growth of restorative justice programs in Aboriginal communities. These programs provide alternatives to the justice system. They also provide corrective measures and community healing that is organized by the communities themselves. We will be watching a film called Hollow Water, which is about one of these restorative justice programs. We'll also be engaging in a forum about this film, so I look forward to a discussion with you.